What's up guys, Nate Vincent here with FCPro. Today we are going to be diving into the rear wheel bearing on this BMW 328i behind me. Rear wheel bearings on BMWs are one of the more dreaded jobs. It requires pressing the old bearing out and pressing the new one back in. Now it isn't as hard as most people make it out to be, so we're going to walk through all the steps you need to know to diagnose your wheel bearing, to remove the axle and the brakes to get to the wheel bearing, and then the actual job of pressing the old wheel bearing out and the new one back in. Before we get started, let's take a quick look at the tools we're going to need to do this job. So the tools needed to get the job done are going to be some basic hand tools, torque wrenches, we have some long pry bars, hammers, and a bunch of impact sockets. One specialty tool you're going to need is a 30mm 12-point socket, and that's going to loosen up the axle. Now aside from that, the tools you're really going to need are the things to press and pull and push the wheel bearings and the axles into place. Now we have a wheel bearing kit. This is going to be really great for pulling the wheel bearing out and pushing it back in. We have the hub puller kit, so this is basically going to pull the hub away from the upright. And then lastly, this great little guy here, 24 by 1.5. This is going to thread on the end of the axle, and when you reassemble it, it's actually going to pull the axle back into the hub that we pulled out here. All of these tools make it a lot easier to put the job back together. Now, one additional tool you may want to have on standby just in case is this right here. This is a race puller. Now often when we're using this big tool here to pull the hub out, the wheel bearing races come out with it. If that happens, this tool is really a great tool to be able to get those races off it and reuse that hub rather than having to purchase a new hub. On the newer cars like this F30 behind me, you're going to need this little axle press tool. So the axles on these cars are actually pressed into the hub. And to get them out, you're going to use a little device like this. So this bolts down to the wheel hub, and this basically pushes the axle right out of the hub and allows you to change that wheel bearing. So without further ado, let's jump into this job and let's get it done. All right, so the first thing we're going to do after lifting the car up is we're going to remove the rear wheel where the bearing is that we're servicing. So next thing is going to remove the caliper. This may be slightly different depending on the brake package your car has. In this case, it's two 16mm on the inside. So now that we have the bolts loose, we're just going to pull back on the caliper, and we're going to use a nice little clever caliper hang tool and just get it up and out of the way. Make sure you leave yourself enough room to get access to the axle. So actually hanging this up like this. Using a 6mm Allen, we're going to loosen up the set screw and remove the rotor. So quickly what we're going to do is we're going to knock back the ears on this. So you can see this nut has two ears that are folded in to make sure it can't loosen up. Just carefully taking a flathead screwdriver, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to get a little edge in there, knock it in with a mallet, and I'm going to pry that out very carefully. So the goal is to get it far enough out. This is really rusty, but the goal is to get it far enough out that this can turn this way without this edge catching that little lip right there. And we're going to do the exact same thing down here on the bottom. All right, so now that we got the two ears put back, this can rotate, basically clockwise to come loose. We're going to grab a 30mm 12-point socket that's going to fit nice and tight up here, and we're going to pull this off. Now when we go to reassemble it, we're going to use a new nut, and we're going to knock those back in to make sure it locks in place. So just wiping a little bit of the rust and grime off the end of this axle nut, or where this axle nut was threaded on. We're going to clean that up, and then we're going to try to push this through. So we can get the axle removed from the hub, and then we're going to pull the axle off the differential. All right, so here we are. We have this nice little hydraulic press here, specifically made to actually push on that stub axle and basically clamp to this wheel face and push that through. But the lug nuts we found, the existing lug nuts from the car, right here, were a little too short. So we have these studs. We're going to install these studs to have a little bit extra thread length to make sure we have that engagement in here. We're not pulling threads out. And then we're going to go crank this thing down, and we're going to see if we can get that stub axle to move through. So now you can see we've set this already up, so it's about at the right depth it needs to be. This whole thing is adjustable, so we have an adjustment here, and then this is actually our hydraulic press that's going to push it out. So slide that on, make sure it's seated all the way against the hub, and then we'll install the nuts finger tight. And now we're going to tighten this down. I can already feel the pressure on it. And we're going to watch the back side of the axle and see if the axle moves at all coming out. All right, so the next step, now that we know that the wheel bearing is moving out, the axle is moving outside of the hub, What we're going to do is we're going to leave this whole system attached, and we're going to unbolt right here, and right here. So this is going to basically unbolt the entire bottom section of the knuckle. That's going to allow this entire knuckle to swing up out of the way. Then we can continue to press that axle out, and we're going to pop it out of the diff, and we're going to be able to pull that axle right out. Now, to make it a little easier for you guys to see, I'm going to pull this little plastic cover off this control arm here. That's just going to give the camera a little bit better view of what we're doing here, so you can see exactly how we're doing it. So the first one we're going to pull off is this 18 millimeter. This is threaded directly into the upright, so we don't need a nut on the other side, or hold a nut on the other side. Move that up out of the way. Now we're going to do this one right here. Now this one has a bolt and a nut on it, so you're going to have to counter hold the nut. So this is a 21 counter hold and a 21 socket right here. So the last one we're going to remove here is the 18 with an 18 counter hold on the front link here. So we have the toe link undone, we have the rear camber arm undone, and we left the bolt in on the bottom link. We're just going to send that out, and now we should be free to move the hub whatever way we need. So now that we have this totally free on the bottom, we should be able to move. Once I get everything freed up, there we go. Get this out of the way. You can see now we can actually pull this whole assembly outward, which means that we can continue tightening this down, pushing this axle out of the stub, and we can pull this away from the car to make sure it has enough room to move. Perfect. So now that we got the axle out of the hub, what we're going to do is we're just going to pop it out of the diff. Some of the threads on the end of this are a little bit hairy, so we're going to put a dye on it and just to clean them up a little bit, make sure we don't have this issue again. So I'm going to show you the easy way to pop the axle out of the differential on these late model BMWs. You're going to want something, I usually use a hammer, but you want something that's going to basically be about 1 inch to 1.5 inches wide. 2x4 would probably work here. Anything basically you need to leverage against this little ear on the diff. And then you're going to want a crowbar or pry bar that can get in this little groove here. So you can see what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this hammer up here so I have something to leverage against. That's not going to hurt. And I'm going to get the groove of this pry bar, the tip of this pry bar in that groove, and I'm just going to pop. You ready? Oops. Almost. There we go. And now we're just going to have to lift up on this a little bit. Is there any way you can lift up? There we go. And we can pull the axle right out, just like that. Just be careful of the seals. As you can see, there's a little snap ring in there, a little retaining clip, and that just deflects when it pops in, and that's what actually holds it in place. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pull the stub axle out and just pull it out of the bearing. We're going to use a special puller for that, but before we do that, we actually have to pull the emergency brake. So it's this drum brake assembly here to make sure that the puller has something to push against. So to do that, what we're going to do is we take a 5mm Allen, and we're going to go through kind of rotating the hub so we find that release. This is just a basic little push in and turn 90 degrees. So we're going to push that in, turn it 90 degrees. So to show you kind of what that looks like, that's just like this. So basically, it goes into the backing plate, turns and locks. And so what we have to do is push it in, compress the spring, turn it, unlock it, and pull it out. There's one on either side. And then using these two tools, needle nose pliers and a pick, we're going to release the springs that hold the two shoes together. All right, so before we go and press this out, we need to get this backing plate off. So it's a couple bolts. We have a 16mm over here. All right, so now that we have the axle all set to be put back in the car, all the dust shields off, we're going to pull this stub axle out. So the tool we're going to use for this is this Astro tool here. Sold on the site, it is a puller. You can see right here, we basically have the whole setup, and I'm going to show you how to actually get the setup. So one of the things you want to do is you want to take your new wheel bearing, and there's going to be a series of different washers that you can use, and you want to make sure that the washer fits through here. The whole goal of this is to be able to pull this stub axle out without pulling the inner races of this bearing apart. So we want to make sure that whatever we're going to put through there passes through this bearing first. What we're going to do is we're going to set up with this, obviously this is set up so you can pull it in different things. You can pull rotors, you can pull wheel bearings and stubs. What we're going to do is set it up for a stub. These are going to fold in, they're going to push against the part of the car right here. They're going to push against the upright. And then we're going to have this bolt come through. And like I said, you got to make sure this passes through the wheel bearing. So we know that passes through the wheel bearing. We're going to send this through. We're going to put this on the back side of the stub. We're going to thread this big nut right on. And then what we're going to do is counter hold this nut, and we're going to tighten this down. What it's going to do is it's going to basically pull that stub right away from that knuckle and out of that wheel bearing. So Let's jump in. All right, so now that we had a nice explosion of the wheel bearing, obviously you can see the race is separated. The outer race popped out. We were hoping that wouldn't happen, but sometimes that happens. So if that does happen, same sort of procedure. The only thing that might have gotten damaged in here is, as you can see, the snap ring is a little bit bent. We're gonna pull that out. Worst case scenario, if you really need to get the car back together, you pull that out, set that down on a bench, and you can take a hammer and you can try to straighten out these edges. They just twist a little bit. Usually if you just take the tension off them, they straighten themselves out. Now we're going to be using this really nice CTA snap ring plier, and we're going to take the snap ring out. Now be careful here because this is obviously under tension again, and we want to make sure that we don't snap this thing out too much. So the next step is we're going to do pretty much the same thing we did with the sub axle pulling it out, but we're going to do it with the wheel bearing itself. All right, so now we are going to pull the new bearing back in here. A couple things what you want to do is, obviously we're going to kind of do the same thing we did pulling it out in reverse. So the bolt's going to go through. We're going to put a plate that's going to block off the whole back side just like this. And then the bearing is going to be here with a plate behind it, and we're going to, as we tighten that bolt, it's going to pull that bearing into this bore. Now before we do that, I actually cleaned this out really, really well, vacuumed it out, made sure all the rust and any debris that's in here is out. Also, any metal chips that might be stuck to your ABS wheel speed sensor here, you want to make sure you clean those up while you're in there. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a little bit of motor oil, whether it's 1030, 040, whatever you got laying around, put a teeny bit on my finger, and I'm just going to kind of wipe around this bore, making sure that it has just a little bit of motor oil on it. That's just going to help the bearing slide in there a little bit more easily. You also want to make sure nothing is jammed up against the edge that the bearing sits up against, because you want to make sure the bearing can go all the way into the bore and not sit crooked. Now remember, the magnetic side is going inboard, like we talked about. So you can see here, this is not the magnetic side. This side here is the magnetic side, so this is going to go inboard on the car. So we're just going to get that started, get that in the lead in here. Now when you're working with the new wheel bearing and installing it, this is really when it's critical to make certain that the piece you're using to pull the bearing in actually is pushing on the outer race of the bearing and not on the inside race of the bearing. You can actually damage your bearings by putting them in if you're pushing on the. So now we are installing the snap ring. So we have a new snap ring. We have the stub axle. You can see that it clearly got very hot where the inner race of the wheel bearing was worn out. But you can see that we still have a race of the wheel bearing on here. So we need to get this off. So we have a special tool here, a bearing splitter, that actually helps clamp down on this and split the bearing off and gives us a nice, easy way to do it. If you don't, you can use basically punches and try to push on this. I've seen people get really, really stuck where they actually very carefully take a die grinder and cut this a little bit and split the race and get it off. But either way, you're going to have to get this race off before this can get pressed in, and we can reassemble this wheel bearing. Clamp this thing down. You can see it's holding onto the edge of that race. That's the whole point, is to try to get this. You can see these edges around that. And then what we're going to do is we set this up just like this. So there's the race that was jammed on there. Now we have this off. So now installing this is going to be similar to pulling it off. We're going to put some oil on here, and then we're going to press it in. All right, so here we have the whole setup. You can see we have a press plate on the back side of the axle stub. And then we have the backing plate here and the nut obviously in my hand, so we're going to send this through. Key here, I put some oil on there. You want to keep everything nice and straight. You want to make sure that you're pulling against the bearing itself. Okay, nice and tight. Now we'll loosen it up and check all our clearances. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're prepping for the axle install. So to prep for the axle install, I'm going to make sure these splines are nice and clean inside, make sure we're ready to get it, and I'm going to get a friend who's going to pull the suspension up so we can get the axle installed. Now remember, before we actually went and cleaned up the thread on the axle to make sure we had no issues, you definitely want to do that while that's out of the car. It's a lot easier than doing it while it's in the car.
Good now.
All right, so I'm just going to get this ready. I called a friend over to give me a hand. So I'm just going to get this prepped and ready to go by lining it up here. And then make sure my hands are clean. I'm going to line this up into the diff. Just want to be careful of that seal. All right, so now we're going in the right direction. Make sure the gear spline's lined up. There we go, we're seated. Without marring up any more threads than we already have, we're gonna angle this up, or bring that down. So now we're just threading on this adapter. That's gonna basically allow us to pull the axle through the hub and make sure that's nice and square and straight. Make sure the threads are all the way down on that. And then using this nice tool, you can see this will thread right in there. So we'll get that started. Get a couple threads engaged there. And then we can tighten this down. Using an adjustable, it's gonna pull that axle right through that hub. All right, so the next thing we're gonna do is I'm going to quickly just bolt the bolts through. We're not gonna actually torque them down, but we have new hardware, as many of these are torque to yield, or tighten to yield, so we're gonna replace them. So what I'm gonna do is basically put the bolts in now without this backing plate here. It's a little easier to get to everything. Then we're gonna install the backing plate, then we're gonna go torque all of these suspension bolts down. All right, so now we're going to tighten down the backing plates. So we're just gonna get this located. And then we're gonna install the 10mm fasteners and the 1/16mm fastener. So now it's time to install the drum brake. We get our actuator installed. And then what I'm gonna do is grab the adjuster. We'll leave the bottom spring off for now. All right, so now that we have everything at ride height, we can go torque everything down. So everything's locked in place. We need to torque down the bottom. These two here, this one here, and remember we loosened this one up to let this bushing flex a little bit. So we need to tighten that one down too. All the bolts that have the funny looking safety washer on them, the little triangle, these are gonna be 100 Newton meters plus 90 degrees, and these are torque to yield, so we need to replace these bolts. So that's 100. Right there, 90. Now we're gonna do the same to this one up here. The last two we need to tighten down is this one right here and this one right here. This guy right here is gonna be 100 Newton meters, no torque to yield. Or this is torque to yield, but we don't have to stretch it out. And this one right here is gonna be the big one at 165. So let's get our torque wrench and let's do it. Okay, 100. Now that we have all these suspension torqued down and good to go, what we're gonna do is we're gonna bolt the rotor, we're gonna bolt the caliper, get everything bolted back together, and then the final thing we're gonna do is we're gonna put the axle nut in, we're gonna tighten it down. The reason we're putting the brakes on first is so we can have a way to clamp the wheel to keep it from spinning as we torque that axle tight. All right, so the last step of this job, aside from putting the wheel on, is we gotta put the axle nut on. So I put a little bit of anti-seize on there, not much. As you can see, I just dabbed a little on there, just to make it a little easier. You don't want it going in the actual splines, you just want it on the threads itself. And here's the nut we're gonna put on. So we're gonna need a 30mm 12 point, just like we took it off with. We're gonna be tightening this down to 145 Newton meters, and then we're gonna be turning it 45 degrees. So not a full 90, just 45. All right, now we gotta do 45 degrees. All right, there we go. So the last little thing we're gonna do here is we're gonna lock this in place. So we're gonna bend these ears in, and that's going to keep the nut from being able to back off. So way to do that, just take a flathead screwdriver, preferably one you don't care too much about, and that will keep that from being able to turn back and come loose. All right, everyone, that is doing the rear wheel bearing on a BMW F30 328. Now there's a couple extra steps on these newer cars, such as pressing out the axle and making sure you can pull the axle back in. It's a little different, but it is not all that different from the typical rear wheel bearing on a BMW, from everything from an E30 to an E90 or an E46. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give us a thumbs up. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments below. And if you want to see more content like this, please subscribe to our channel. We'll catch you on the next one.